So we're going to talk about watercolor techniques today, and I will be showing you a variety of them, around 23, 24 techniques that you're able to use. When working with watercolors, it's very exciting. There is one problem, that it is permanent, and if you make a mistake, you have to make that happy little accident work. When we're working with watercolors, one thing that we want to know is when we're working, if they're dry, if we can continue on, can we touch it? And the best way is to touch with the back of your hand. So there is also a little attachment that you can see all these techniques in written instructions. So hopefully that'll be helpful to you. I've gridded out a little bit bigger than 2" by 2" square all the different techniques that I'm going to show you today. So let's begin. When I'm preparing to use watercolors, I add water into the tray of each color, not a lot, just a droplet or two, just to get the color saturated and to start to mix the consistency of the paint to either make it more translucent, which would be thinner, or opaque, which would be thicker. So it's really kind of a good way to start getting the consistency of your watercolors going. We're going to talk about the different types of brushes. Now most of you got this round brush in your set, and rounds come in a variety of sizes. You may have other brushes too. You might have a beveled one or flat one. But if you don't, this is the brush. That round brush is what we'll be using. Some brushes have a beveled tip on the back of their brushes, and I will go over and discuss how to use that beveled tip. It can be used for making marks inside on your watercolors. It can be used to flatten any edges that you may have. So let's talk about the differences between opaque and translucent. Opaque means no light can go through, and the translucent means light can come through the paint. So it allows it to pass through. So you'll notice here I am just putting down a light coating of my paint. I have just used a little water and a little color for the translucent. Now, to make it more opaque, I'm going to take my brush and I'm stirring it into the color blue, and I'm really kind of working it out and making it really thick, very pasty like. And you can see the color difference. This is a good exercise in knowing the difference between opaque and translucent. And it's also good to figure out how much you can load onto your paintbrush. So we're going to talk about a solid wash. You want to use a flat, wide brush, but if you don't, that's fine. And what you're doing is putting a nice, solid, thick, consistent block of color down. And it's just kind of going over and pushing the color around and making it consistent, a solid block of color. The other thing we need to do is when we're working on these test techniques is we want to put some color down that needs to dry. So I have it down for glazing, negative painting, lifting, feathering, and magic eraser. All right, on to graded wash. Okay, for graded wash, you are going to take, again, a wide, flat brush, but if you don't, that's fine. You're going to dip it in some color, and then you're going to take the color and you're going to push it across the paper. And you can see I've loaded the paintbrush there, and I'm going across the paper. Now I'm going to dip into water, not paint, just water, and I am going to push the pigment, or the pigment will follow the water down, so it'll have a gradation of value. Now, one thing that might be helpful, if you get too much, you can see it's pooling. I'm grabbing a paper towel and I'm lifting up some of that moisture. And I'm also gently taking it to the bottom there, gently pulling up a little excess color. So now we have a graded wash. Okay, so we're going to do wet on wet right now. And the first thing you need to do is put water down on the paper. And then you're going to make sure you have enough water. Looks like it's good. And now we're going to select a color and we are bringing it down. And you can see how the color is bleeding down. It's pretty cool how it just bleeds over the water. And if need be, when I'm done with that, I can take a paper towel and just pick up any excess moisture that may have, like on the bottom. So we're going to do drop color on wet color. And I'm first placing a layer of red down into this square. I'm making sure it's somewhat translucent. You don't want it to be too thick. You don't want it to be opaque. After that, you're going to take another color, and I'm taking blue, and I am dropping it into the red. And some color mixing is happening at the same time. This technique is really good for adding to, let's say you're doing a clump of flowers or trees, or it could even be you're creating a pattern in someone's shirt or pants or shorts or dress. And it is a fun way to subtly add a pattern or an area of interest to a watercolor. Dry brush. You have to have a brush that is dry, no moisture on it. And you can see here I am just pushing the pigment across the page with the dry brush, and it could give the impression of grass or fields in the distance or even hair. So that's what that technique is really good for. Then there is pushing out pigment, and you use a flat brush. You could use a round, and you kind of reverse how you're using your brush. Again, it could be for grass. It could be, you can use it for siding on a house. A variety of techniques can be used, or variety of spots that you can use this technique. Okay, we're going to talk about the wipeout technique. I've put a fresh layer of blue paint on. I'm grabbing a paper towel and I am wiping out sections of the blue paint. This is a great way to paint clouds. It's also a great way to remove any coloring, but I like how I can just kind of work it in and I can get it so it feels like a cloud. Perfect technique for clouds. Next is detail painting. This is just a way to play with your brushes and to know what they can do and what kind of fine lines and thick lines you can get. I just used a round one. Now I'm going to use a flat brush, and the flat brush is one of my favorite because we can get thick and thin lines, and we can spin and rotate it and really make some interesting effects with it. If I could only have one brush, I would have a flat brush because I'm able to do thin lines and thick lines super easily. And it's kind of, the more you begin to paint, you'll realize you may or may not have a favorite brush. And I really prefer a flat brush over a round brush. All right, let's move on. And our next one that we're going to be doing is scrumbling. And with scrumbling, you're going to take your round brush and a lighter color. So you can see I'm taking yellow here. And I'm just really just pushing color around. And this is a good way to layer your watercolor. So you work from light to dark. Now I'm going to pick up another color and I'm adding the green over what I just did. So I'm getting some nice variety of value in there, and I'm mixing the color on top of each other. It's a nice kind of abstract effect, but it also gives a sense of an illusion and light as well. All right, so the next thing we're going to move on to is masking. So I'm taking some painter's tape, that blue painter's tape, and you can use regular masking tape as well. And I'm going to lay it down on that little section. One side is I've ripped in half, so one side is going to be more organic and soft, and the other end is going to be sharp and flat. And so now I'm just taking some scrap pieces and pressing them down into the paper. Now, one thing, you can see I was pushing it down, but that beveled edge of my paintbrush that I used earlier, I'm going to use that to burnish the edges so no paint can seep underneath the tape. It's really important that you burnish your edges. And once I feel like I've burnished my edges well and that it's sealed down, I can grab my paint. And so now I'm going to paint around the tape edges, and I don't have to worry about trying to make a straight line or sharp edge because the tape is doing it for us. And I'm going to select two different colors. So you can see I've put down this red, and then I'm going to put down a little bit of orange. And it's a little on the thick side. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to take my paper towel and I'm going to start to lift some of that color so it's not as thick. And this is just a good way you know how to manage your paint and just to get different effects. And there it is, dried, and the tape has been removed. Alright, so now we're going to move on to scratch wet and scratch dry. This is another interesting technique that you can do. The orange square there is dry. We're going to do another one that is wet. So I'm putting down the wet paint. And what I will be doing is, again, I will be taking that beveled edge, but you can use any kind of edge, and I'm going to scrape into the paint. Now you can see when it's wet, I am pulling up color, but I'm also making some indentations into the paper and into the paint. This is a great way to create texture. Now when I do this with the wet, you have to be careful that you don't over smear, but it turns out pretty cool. And there you can see with the dry that it makes some nice scratches, but you also want to be careful not to rip the paper. Alright, let's add some salt. And what's this all about? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to put down a color. So I'm going to grab a little violet. Violet, you're turning violet. And I'm putting that violet down and just working the color around the square, adding some water. And then I'm going to sprinkle salt on top of that. I have two different types of salt. I have the big kosher salt chunks and just regular iodized salt. And we let that sit there and dry on the paint, and it'll create a lovely texture that you can use for sand, is one of my favorite uses for using salt, or rocks as well. So that's just got to sit and dry. And it's really fun to see the results. So here they come. There's the results. There's one little section, and then here is another example of salt. And there is another example of salt being used in painting. Alright, let's use the straw technique. So we want to put a little bit of paint down, just a little puddle, and then I'm going to grab my straw and I'm going to blow the paint around. I really like this technique for adding branches onto a tree or to add an interest into my watercolor. And what I love about it is It's very, it's it's just straight. There's no little curves or lines. It just goes for it. You see the branches flowing out. And I'll show you an example of a cherry tree, leaves and blossoms using the straw technique. It's a fun one. And I have the same straw that I use over and over at home. You don't want to waste and, cut a straw and use it and then throw it away. Just love all those little fine lines that you get from it. And you can also mix colors or overlap colors. And there is the cherry branch drawing. All right, let's go on to glazing. Glazing is a technique that you use when a color is dry, for example, the yellow, and then you're painting another color, a darker color over it, and we're using a blue. And then when it goes over the yellow, it creates a secondary color of green. So that is called glazing, and that's very intentional. It's not like we're trying to cover up something. It's just that we want that area to be green, but we want a nice, crisp, sharp edge. All right, on to negative painting. Negative painting is a way to actually cover up an area that you've made a mistake. Your paint is going to be opaque. So you can see I'm really working it. It's kind of layering up the color. And I am covering it up and making a little scene, or I'm going to make a little window view here using the opaque paint and covering up different sections. So technically this is called negative painting. And I like when we have little happy little accidents, that this is a good way to resolve some of those issues that we might have. And you can see it's just kind of a fun way also to play around with layering of color. All right, lifting or feathering out. Lifting or feathering out is a great way to cover up mistakes. So I have just plain water, and I'm kind of scrubbing the area or scrubbing the edge and working the paint off. At the same time, I do get a paper towel and I lift any color that I may have, and I'm really working hard to remove that color. And you can see that little kind of blop of water. It's slowly lifting and being removed. Then let's say we want to push that color out. Then that is called feathering. So on the top edge there, I am kind of dropping some water and mixing it together with the paint that is on the paper. And you can see it's becoming more organic and not so sharp. So it's really quite lovely. It's a good way to help resolve any issues that you may be having. And you can see how I'm pushing that color around so it feels even. All right, on to magic erasers. Eraser. You may or may not have one of these at home, but it's a fun way, again, to problem solve an area that you want to remove. So I'm masking it a section off with the blue painter's tape. And of course I want to burnish those edges. Make sure they're nice and flat to the paper. I'm going to grab my magic eraser. I'm going to dip it in water, squeeze out the water, and then I'm going to actually scrub the paper. And I am lifting and removing the yellow paint. And it's almost like magic. And then take a paper towel and dry it up. And just doing the last of the removal there. And with cheaper papers, it will kind of crumble apart on you. But look at that nice, sharp, clean edge. It is truly magic. All right, now I'm going to remove that masking tape off the area that we mask. I like to pull the tape off at an angle so it doesn't rip the paper. Another little trick I use to keep the paper from ripping is I put the masking tape on my clothes and pick up a little lint to ensure that it doesn't stick to the paper. All right, sandpaper and watercolor pencil. So you're going to take some water and you're going to put a blob of water down onto that square. And when you're working with watercolors, it's really wise to change your water pretty regularly because the pigment will get affected or will affect the water. Now you can see here I am taking a watercolor pencil and I'm sanding it on a piece of sandpaper, and I'm taking the flecks into or dropping them onto the water, and you can see how it's scattering and bleeding out and leaving a texture. The other thing I can do is I can take the watercolor pencil and I can draw into the blob of water. And the cool thing about this is when you're using watercolor pencils, you can blend the color right in, or you can leave it as a sharp line. It's up to you. I really love watercolor pencils. They're really, they help to make a watercolor sharp and crisp and add definition to whatever you're working on. Unfortunately, they are expensive. So I'm also going to take my paper towel and just kind of dry up any areas that need to be pulled up, a little excess moisture. You'll also notice that the paper towel has left a texture as well. And I'm just scraping off a little bit more of the remnants just so it bleeds a little bit more and to get that soft texture. Pretty cool, huh? All right, so now we're done with that. I want to talk about the sponge. I forgot to add that to our list. So I've taken my sponge, I squished it up, I've dipped it into a color, and I'm moving it around. This technique is really nice for doing bushes or leaves on a tree. It also works really well to layer up color. You just move your sponge around and pick up paint in a different section. So that is some fun and interesting watercolor techniques that I hope you apply to your paintings. I encourage you to explore them and mix them together. I have two more to show you and then we're done. It's called blooms. You're going to throw down some water and then you are going to drop color in, and you can see how it kind of bleeds out. I love, love, love this technique. It is a great way to show flowers in the distance or a patch of rocks off in the distance. Lots of different things you can do with plumes. You can load color on top of color, and you can see here it's just really interesting how it all bleeds out, and it's fun to watch. And I like taking colors and layering them. The last technique I want to show you is probably one that most people love to do and didn't know that it was a technique, but you are flicking color across the page with just your fingertip. You can see I'm just splattering it. And that can be for waves crashing on the shore, the water splatter. And here are two final pieces just to kind of give you some ideas of what you can do with blooms and watercolors. Have a great day.